My daughter did not invite me to her wedding yet, still asked for my beach house for her honeymoon, and in that moment the ground beneath my certainty moved, reshaping everything I believed about us. For with all the love and care I had poured into her life, I believed her marriage would begin in a way that reflected the bond we once shared. What followed was not what anyone imagined, and the choice I made that day changed more than her plans, opening a path that no one could have foreseen. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. I had always believed that the day my daughter married would be one of the proudest days of my life. A day when I would stand by her side, hand her to the man she loved, and watch her step into the next chapter with joy and dignity. But instead I found myself cast aside as though my presence was unnecessary, as though the sacrifices that had built her life were invisible, and that sting cut deeper than any wound I had ever known. For years I had told myself that patience and love were enough, that my daughter would always know who had stood in her corner, who had held her hand when the world seemed too heavy, who had gone without so that she could have more. But on the day I expected to be acknowledged, I was left with silence. A silence that rang louder than church bells. A silence that told me without words that I was no longer part of her story. Yet even in that silence, before I had time to process the depth of it, she came to me with her request, bold and without hesitation, telling me that though she could not include me in her vows or her celebration, she still wanted my beach house, the house I had built with sweat and determination, the house that had stood as a refuge for our family, the house that carried the memory of my late wife and the laughter of summers long gone. My breath caught as she spoke, and though I kept my face calm, inside me a storm gathered, because her words revealed more than ingratitude. They revealed entitlement, a sense that my years of sacrifice had bound me to serve her forever, regardless of whether she honored me or not. I remember standing there, listening, my hand tightening unconsciously against the edge of the table, my mind racing back through the years, the birthdays where I stretched every penny to make sure she had gifts to open, the winters when I wore the same old coat so she could have new clothes, the nights I worked 2 jobs so she could go to college without debt, and I wondered how she had forgotten, how she could speak to me with such detachment, as if I were no longer her father but merely a gatekeeper to the luxuries she wanted. The beach house was not just a building, it was the embodiment of my struggle. Every beam and brick a reminder of the nights I stayed late to earn enough to build it, every wave that touched its shore, a whisper of the dreams my wife and I once shared. And to hear my daughter demand it as though it were hers, by right without even inviting me to her wedding, filled me with a cold clarity I had never known. I did not shout. I did not argue. I did not let her see the storm inside me, because I knew in that moment that the story was no longer about her request, but about my response. And though she could not have known it then, the choice I would make would show her that a father may give endlessly, but he is not to be discarded without consequence. And that night marked the beginning of a path she never expected me to take. In the weeks leading up to what I thought would be my daughter's wedding, I lived with a sense of anticipation that both comforted and unsettled me, because even though she had grown distant in recent years, I told myself that on her special day everything would come full circle, that all the sacrifices I had made would finally be acknowledged, that I would stand beside her and see in her eyes the gratitude and love I had carried in mine for decades, and I prepared myself in ways that only a father could. I set aside money for a suit I thought would make her proud. I practiced a few words I hoped to deliver during the reception, words that spoke of her childhood, of her perseverance, of the way she had filled the empty space her mother left behind with light that kept me going when life threatened to break me. I imagined the walk down the aisle, her hand trembling slightly in mine, just as it had when she was a little girl learning to cross the street, and I thought of the smile I would give her, a smile that told her without words that no matter where life took her, she would always have a father standing at her side. The anticipation warmed me during lonely evenings, and I held on to it as if it were a promise, a reminder that all the long years of sacrifice had meaning, that I was not just a man who had worked and worried and given without end, but a father who would see his devotion culminate in a day of joy. Yet that anticipation shattered in the cruelest way, not with a conversation, not even with a gentle explanation, but with silence, a silence that stretched until the day I realized I had never received an invitation, never been told where or when the wedding would take place, never been given a chance to step into the role I had dreamed of playing since the day she was born. At first I convinced myself it was an oversight, that the mail had been lost, that perhaps she was so overwhelmed with planning that she had simply forgotten to include me on the list. But deep inside, a heavier truth took root, whispering that this was no mistake, that the distance between us had become a wall I could not scale. The realization struck me one quiet morning as I sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty calendar, a calendar I had marked with her birthdays, her milestones, her achievements, yet held no date for the one event I had thought would define us both, and the crushing weight of that discovery left me motionless, my coffee cold, my heart hollow. The anticipation that had once lifted me now collapsed into sorrow, and I found myself questioning every memory, every sacrifice, every moment when I chose her needs over my own, asking whether any of it had mattered to her, whether she had carried those memories with the same reverence that I had. Friends and neighbors asked me if I was ready for the big day, their voices warm with curiosity, and I forced smiles, nodding, hiding the truth, because to admit it aloud would have been to acknowledge the betrayal that I was not yet ready to face. Inside me, the anticipation turned into something jagged, not quite anger, not quite grief, but a piercing awareness that I had been erased from her story, not by accident, but by intention. And that awareness stripped me of the illusions I had clung to. I sat in my living room, staring at the photographs of her childhood, photographs that told the story of a father who had been present at every moment, who had cheered her on from the sidelines, who had stood proud at graduations, who had carried the weight of two parents after her mother was gone. And I wondered how a life so intertwined with mine could now exclude me so completely. The anticipation I once felt, that hopeful vision of pride and joy, was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that filled every corner of my home, a silence that told me I would not be walking her down the aisle. I would not be giving a speech, I would not even be present, and the crushing truth of that reality became the wound that would guide everything that followed. When I look back on the long road that carried me to the moment when my daughter excluded me from her wedding, yet still wanted my beach house, I cannot help but see the endless years of sacrifice that defined my life, years where my choices were shaped, not by my own desires, but by the needs of my child, because from the moment her mother passed, I became both father and mother, protector and provider, and I swore to myself that she would never go without, even if that meant I had to. I worked days that stretched into nights, my hands calloused and my body weary, but every dollar I earned was directed toward her future. Every hour of labor a brick in the foundation of the life I wanted her to have. I still remember the way she looked up at me as a little girl, her small hand gripping mine with absolute trust, and in those eyes I found the strength to push forward when exhaustion threatened to consume me. When she needed clothes, I went without new ones. When she needed school supplies, I skipped meals. When she dreamed of opportunities I had never known, I bent my back and emptied my pockets to make sure those dreams were within her reach. I remember the first time she spoke of college, her voice filled with excitement and hope, and though fear gripped me at the thought of tuition bills, I promised her I would make it happen. And so I took on extra shifts, sold pieces of the small inheritance her grandparents left, and poured everything I had into seeing her walk across that stage with a degree in her hands. I remember the day I bought her first car, not a luxury model, but a sturdy one, paid for with savings I had quietly scraped together while denying myself comforts, because I wanted her to have safety and freedom, not the struggle I endured when I was young. When rent grew too heavy for her in the city, I covered the difference, writing checks with a steady hand even when my own account grew thin, telling myself that it was worth it because she was building a life that would honor the sacrifices I made. Holidays came and went, birthdays passed, and each one was marked by gifts she desired and celebrations she wanted. And though I often spent those moments weary from long weeks of work, I found joy in her smile, convincing myself that the happiness on her face was repayment enough. I remember standing in crowded stores, searching for the right dress for her prom, the one she had dreamed about, and how I pushed aside the guilt of the price tag, because I wanted her to feel like the most radiant girl in the room. I remember the countless small details, too. The lunches packed with care, the school trips funded quietly, the times she needed money for books, rent, groceries, and I never hesitated, never asked for anything in return, never even reminded her later of what I had given. Sacrifice became my second skin, so ingrained in me that I no longer recognized it as extraordinary. It was simply what a father did when love outweighed self. And yet, as I sat in my living room years later, excluded from the one day I had always believed would validate those decades of giving, I realized with a heaviness in my chest that my sacrifices had not etched themselves into her memory the way they had into mine, because to her they seemed invisible, forgotten, or worse, expected, as if they were her right and not my devotion. That realization seared me, because every long night and early morning came flooding back with painful clarity. And though I had once carried them with pride, in that moment I carried them with sorrow, understanding that what I had given freely had been taken as obligation, not love. The day I received the message that would become the letter of exclusion is etched into my memory with painful clarity, because it was not a letter of warmth or gratitude, not an invitation to share in the joy of my daughter's union, but a brief, cold announcement that made it clear my presence was neither wanted nor needed. And I remember holding that envelope in my hands as if it carried the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made, only to realize that inside was nothing more than a reminder of how far she had drifted from me. I had expected, even in my worst doubts, that some acknowledgement would come, perhaps a handwritten note or a phone call, some small gesture that said, "Father, I want you to be part of this day." But instead the message that arrived was impersonal, typed, and stripped of sentiment, offering the date of her marriage as though it were an item in a bulletin, and making no mention of me, no mention of my role, no space reserved for the man who had raised her when no one else would. The words cut sharper because of their brevity, because they carried no softness, no affection, just the bluntness of a schedule that excluded me. And I sat at my kitchen table, staring at them until the lines blurred before my eyes. I remember the way my heart slowed, as if it were trying to shield me from breaking, and how my hands trembled slightly though I pressed them flat against the paper to hide it even from myself. It was in that moment that I realized not only had I been left out, But I had been left out deliberately, intentionally, as if my daughter wanted to draw a line between her new life and the man who had carried her through every storm of her old one. The letter did not thank me for helping her through school, did not mention the car I had purchased so she could drive to her job interviews, did not recall the countless nights when I had stayed awake worrying about her safety. It simply stated that she was to be married and that she wished me well, as though I were an acquaintance rather than her father. I felt a hollow ache spread through my chest, the kind of ache that comes when hope collapses into truth, and I sat there surrounded by the quiet of my home, the photographs of her childhood staring back at me from the walls, each one a testament to the years we had shared, years that seemed erased with a few lines of text. The letter of exclusion was more than a piece of paper. It was a symbol of the distance that had been growing between us, the final confirmation that the daughter I once knew was gone, replaced by someone who could cast me aside with the stroke of a pen. I wanted to tear it up, to rid myself of its cruelty, but instead I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer because part of me knew I needed to remember this moment, needed to keep it as proof of what I had endured, proof that my exclusion had not been imagined but declared. I sat for hours that day, my thoughts circling like vultures, asking how we had come to this, asking if I had given too much, if I had blinded myself with love to the warning signs, if I had allowed her fiancé to twist her view of me until I was no longer a father but a resource to be dismissed. The silence of that day was heavier than any noise, and though my heart ached with betrayal, a seed of clarity began to form, the quiet understanding that if she could exclude me so easily, then I would need to learn to stand not as the forgotten father, but as a man who still carried dignity, a man who still had choices, a man who would not allow this letter to define the rest of his story. When I think about the letter that excluded me from her wedding, I cannot separate it from the slow transformation I had watched unfold in my daughter over the years. A transformation that did not happen overnight, but revealed itself in small ways, until one day I realized the girl who once clung to my hand had become a woman who could look through me as though I were invisible. And I often wonder when the shift truly began. Perhaps it started in college, when she returned home for visits and seemed more impatient with the life we had shared, rolling her eyes at the small traditions I still cherished, speaking of her new friends and experiences as if they were a world apart from mine. Or maybe it was when she met the man who would later become her husband, a man whose charm hid an arrogance I sensed immediately, an arrogance that seemed to grow stronger each time I saw them together. And I noticed how she began to echo his tone, dismissive and sharp, as though she were embarrassed by my simplicity. I would offer advice born from years of struggle, advice I believed would help her, and she would brush it aside with a smile that did not reach her eyes, telling me that times had changed, that she and her fiancé knew better. And though the words stung, I told myself it was just youth, just a phase that would pass once she understood the depth of life's responsibilities. Yet the phase never ended, and slowly she stopped coming to me for help. Not because she no longer needed it, but because she no longer wanted to acknowledge it, though I still provided quietly in the background, paying off debts she never thanked me for, sending checks that were cashed without a word, covering emergencies that her new partner claimed to handle but never truly did. With each year, her gratitude faded, replaced by expectation, and I began to feel like a servant rather than a father, my role reduced to providing rather than guiding. And still I told myself that love required patience, that if I continued to stand by her side, she would remember who I was and what I had given. I recalled dinners where she barely looked up from her phone, moments when she brought her fiancé along, and the two of them spoke in hushed tones as if I were not present, and when I asked about her plans for the future, she would say with clipped certainty that it was none of my concern. The warmth that once filled her voice when she called me had been replaced by formality, the soft word "Dad" replaced by practical requests. And I noticed that our conversations became less about sharing life and more about transactions, as though love had been replaced by accounting. What hurt most was not the sharpness in her words, but the absence of memory. Because when I spoke of her childhood, of the places we had visited, of the nights I stayed up comforting her, she would smile politely as though humoring me. But there was no spark of recognition, no acknowledgement that those moments had defined us both. The transformation became undeniable the closer she grew to her fiancé, for he carried a way of looking at me that stripped me down to nothing but my usefulness, and I began to see that same look in her eyes, a reflection of his influence, a reflection that told me she no longer saw me as a father, but as an obstacle to the independence they craved. When she excluded me from her wedding, it was not a sudden betrayal, but the final step in a long journey, a journey where every small dismissal had added up, every silence had carved a gap between us, every influence had drawn her further away until she was no longer the daughter I had raised, but a stranger who shared her face. I held on to the memory of who she once was, the girl who ran into my arms after school, the teenager who whispered her dreams into the dark of our living room. But the woman who wrote that letter and later demanded my beach house was not that girl anymore, and the transformation that had taken her from my arms to that cold distance became the most painful truth I had ever had to accept. Not long after the sting of receiving that letter of exclusion settled into my heart, I found myself facing a moment that tested me in ways I never thought possible. Because just as I was beginning to come to terms with the reality that I would not be present at my daughter's wedding, she came to me with a request so bold, so detached from the pain she had already caused, that it left me momentarily speechless. I remember the day clearly. The sun was just beginning to set, and I was sitting on the porch of the very beach house she would soon ask for, watching the waves roll in with a kind of peace I rarely allowed myself, when my phone buzzed with a message from her. For a brief moment my heart leapt, foolishly hoping she had changed her mind, that perhaps she had realized the weight of her exclusion and was reaching out to bridge the distance between us. But when I opened her words, I felt my stomach tighten. She asked for the keys to the house, not with gentleness or humility, but with the assumption that her honeymoon plans required my unquestioned compliance, as if the very home I had built with years of sacrifice and the memory of her mother could be handed over like a hotel booking. The message was short and direct, telling me the dates she and her new husband would be staying, asking me to make sure the place was ready, even reminding me to stock the kitchen with their favorite foods, and not a single word acknowledged that I had not been invited to the wedding, not a single word thanked me for what she was asking, not even a trace of warmth softened the demand. I stared at that message for a long time, reading it over and over, the waves crashing softly in the background, and I felt something inside me shift. I remembered the long hours I had poured into this house, how every board and beam carried the sweat of my brow, how I had built it not only as a place of rest, but as a sanctuary for our family. A place where she had once played on the sand as a child, a place where her mother's laughter had once filled the air, and I thought of how she now reduced it to nothing more than a perk she felt entitled to claim. My hand tightened around the phone as I thought of the imbalance between what I had given and what she was asking, because I had already given her everything, from her education to her independence, and now she dared to ask for the very heart of my labor while cutting me out of her life's most important moment. The request was more than audacity. It was a mirror reflecting how she truly saw me. Not as a father to be honored, not as a man to be respected, but as a resource to be tapped when convenient, a tool to provide comfort without the burden of acknowledgement. The pain of that realization cut deeply, but in its place, something steadier began to rise. Because I knew in that instant that my response would define more than her honeymoon. It would define the boundaries of our relationship. It would decide whether I would continue to be treated as an endless well or whether I would finally reclaim the dignity I had surrendered for far too long. I did not respond right away. Instead, I placed the phone on the table and listened to the ocean, letting its rhythm calm me as my thoughts grew clearer. Her request was not simply about the house. It was about the years of sacrifice that had been taken for granted. It was about the father she had chosen to exclude, yet still expected to serve. And as the waves rolled in and out, I realized that this house, this legacy of toil and memory, would not become another item on her list of entitlements. My daughter's request for the beach house became the line in the sand, and though she did not yet know it, her words had set into motion a decision that would leave her facing consequences she had never anticipated. When I read her request for the beach house, my first reaction was not anger but shock. The kind of shock that leaves a man still and quiet, staring at words he cannot believe came from his own child. And as I sat there on the porch, with the ocean stretching endlessly before me, I felt as though the waves themselves were mocking me, carrying away every illusion I had once held about what I meant to her. Betrayal has a way of arriving silently, not in grand gestures, but in the absence of love where it should have been most present. And as I let her words sink in, I realized that this request was not just bold. It was proof that I had been reduced in her eyes to nothing more than the provider of comfort, a man who could be erased from her life, yet still expected to furnish it with convenience. The betrayal struck deeper than the letter of exclusion, because while the letter had cut me out of her wedding, this message revealed she still saw no contradiction in shutting me out while asking for more. As though I existed outside the circle of family, but still within reach of her demands. I thought of the nights I had spent in that house alone after her mother passed, staring at the walls that still echoed with her laughter, the weekends I had driven my daughter there to play in the sand, the evenings when we cooked meals together in the kitchen while the sun dipped into the water, and I wondered how she could forget what the place truly was. Not a property to be claimed, but a sanctuary built with love and sacrifice. Shock gave way to sorrow. Sorrow that pressed heavy on my chest as I recalled all the moments when I had told myself that no matter how distant she seemed, she would never forget where she came from. She would never forget the man who stood beside her through every hardship. Yet here she was, treating me as if I were nothing but the keeper of keys. My mind swirled with images of the girl she once was. The child who cried when I scraped my hands working, the teenager who promised to take care of me when I grew old. And I could not reconcile that memory with the woman who now wrote to me without warmth, without respect, without hesitation. The betrayal was not only in what she asked, but in how she asked it, as though it were expected, as though it were her right. And I realized that somewhere along the way, I had allowed her to believe that my sacrifices were endless, that my giving had no boundary, that no matter how she treated me, I would always hand over whatever she wanted. I sat with that thought until the sun disappeared and the stars began to pierce the night sky, and the quiet of the beach house felt heavier than it had in years, because it was no longer filled with the warmth of memories, but with the coldness of realization. Shock and betrayal mingled until they became something sharper, something that began to carve clarity into my heart. And I knew that this was the moment when I had to decide whether I would continue to let myself be treated as an afterthought or whether I would finally draw a line. Betrayal can break a man, but it can also awaken him. And as I stared at the phone still resting on the table beside me, I understood that her request was more than a demand. It was a test, and my answer would decide not only the future of the beach house, but the future of how I allowed myself to be seen. The shock of her words lingered, the betrayal burned, but beneath both a new resolve began to stir. One that told me I would not simply hand over what she asked for, not this time, not after everything that had already been taken from me. Not long after I received her request for the beach house, I found myself confronted with a truth even harsher than the words she had already written. A truth I stumbled upon by accident, yet one that etched itself into my memory with such clarity that I knew it could never be erased. And it came on an evening when I stopped by a restaurant in town where I knew my daughter and her fiancé often met friends. I had no intention of seeing them. I only wanted a quiet meal. But as fate would have it, they were seated just a few tables away, their laughter carrying across the room, and though I tried to keep my eyes on my plate, I could not block out the sound of their voices. It was then that I heard the words that stripped away the last remnants of illusion, words spoken by my own daughter as she leaned in toward her fiancé and told him that the only reason she still bothered with me at all was because of the assets I controlled, particularly the beach house, and that once they had it for their honeymoon, they would barely have to deal with me again. He laughed at her remark, raising his glass in a mocking toast, calling me useful only as long as I kept giving. And then he added that old men like me cling to their possessions until someone clever enough finds a way to pry them loose. I sat frozen, my fork heavy in my hand, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the rest of their conversation. Yet each word that did reach me was like a dagger, confirming what I had feared but had not wanted to believe, that in their eyes I was not a father, not a man who had given his entire life to ensure hers was comfortable, but a wallet, a set of keys, a resource to be drained until nothing remained. My daughter smiled at his words, not with discomfort or protest, but with agreement, and in that smile I saw the full weight of how far she had drifted, how completely she had let his arrogance reshape the way she looked at me. The betrayal of her letter and her demand for the beach house had been painful enough, but hearing her speak so casually, so coldly, stripped me of any lingering hope that perhaps she was caught between loyalty and influence, and showed me instead that she had made her choice freely. I forced myself to sit still, to finish my meal quietly, because I knew that if I revealed my presence in that moment, I would speak with anger rather than clarity, and I did not want anger to guide me. I wanted the truth to settle deep enough in my bones that when I acted, it would be with precision, not impulse. I paid my bill and walked out into the cool night air, the sound of their laughter still ringing in my ears. And as I stood under the streetlight, I felt an ache in my chest, so sharp it nearly doubled me over, not just because of what I had heard, but because of what it meant. It meant that every sacrifice I had made was invisible to her now. It meant that the love I had poured into her life had been repackaged in her mind as obligation. It meant that the bond between us was no longer defined by trust, but by what she believed she could take. Yet as painful as it was, overhearing those truths also freed me, for it stripped away the last of my illusions, the last of my desperate hope that she still saw me as the man who had raised her, and it cleared my vision with the sharpness of reality. They believed they had me cornered, that my love for her would always outweigh my pride, that I would hand over the beach house without hesitation, but they had underestimated me, and as I walked home that night, beneath the quiet stars, I knew that their words had ignited something in me far stronger than grief, a cold resolve that would soon shape the course of everything that followed. That night, after I overheard my daughter and her fiancé mocking me, I lay awake in my bed staring at the ceiling, my mind refusing to quiet. And it was there, in the silence of my room, that the torrent of thoughts began to pour through me. An inner monologue that would not let me rest, dragging me through every memory, every sacrifice, every moment that had defined my life as a father, and forcing me to confront the cruel contrast between the man I had been and the man they now believed me to be. I thought of the nights I had worked until my body ached, the calluses on my hands that never seemed to heal, the mornings when I left before sunrise so that she could wake to a life that felt secure. And I wondered how all of that could be reduced in her mind to nothing more than access to a beach house. I thought of her as a child, her laughter echoing through the halls, her arms around my neck as she told me she loved me more than anything, and I asked myself, when those words had lost their meaning, when her love had turned into calculation, when the bond between us had been traded for convenience. I thought of the moments after her mother's passing, when she cried herself to sleep and I sat beside her, whispering promises that I would always protect her, always provide for her, always put her first. And I wondered if those promises had somehow convinced her that I was unbreakable, that I would never reach a point where my devotion ended, that I was a man to be used rather than honored. My mind turned to the beach house, the place where so much of our family's history was written, where I had poured not only money but spirit into creating a home that carried the echoes of laughter, the smell of summer meals, the warmth of holidays spent together. And I realized that to hand it over now would not only be a betrayal of myself, but a betrayal of the woman I had once loved and the family we had built together. The monologue inside me grew louder, pressing questions I could not ignore, asking why I had allowed myself to be treated as though love required endless sacrifice without respect, why I had hidden behind patience when firmness was needed, why I had mistaken silence for peace when silence only allowed the distance to grow. I asked myself whether I was ready to continue down this path, to give in once more, to let them take the house and with it the last piece of myself, or whether I was finally ready to draw a boundary that could not be crossed. As the hours passed, my grief began to cool, hardening into something steadier, a determination that felt foreign at first, but soon became the anchor of my thoughts. I told myself that I was not a wallet, I was not a set of keys, I was not a resource to be drained. I was a man who had lived a life of sacrifice and who deserved to be remembered for it, and if they would not give me that respect, then I would claim it myself. My mind rehearsed what I might say, how I might act, and I realized that I did not need to shout. I did not need to beg. I did not need to argue. I only needed to act with the quiet strength that comes from truth, because truth requires no defense. It only requires resolve. By the time the first light of dawn crept through my window, the monologue inside me had shifted from sorrow to strategy, from confusion to clarity. And I understood that everything they had said, everything they had done, had given me the answer I needed. I would not hand over the beach house. I would not allow them to mock me while enjoying the fruits of my labor. I would not be the silent father erased from the wedding, yet expected to provide for the honeymoon. I would be the man who remembered his worth and acted upon it, and though they did not yet know it, the plan was already forming in my mind. The beach house was never just a structure of wood and stone to me. It was the embodiment of decades of sacrifice, of dreams carefully stitched together through long nights and weary mornings, a place that carried the memories of my late wife and the echoes of my daughter's laughter when she was still young enough to believe her father was her whole world. And as I sat there, reflecting on her demand for its use, I realized that this house had become the clearest symbol of everything I had worked for, and everything I now stood to lose if I allowed it to fall into ungrateful hands. I remembered the first time I laid eyes on the empty plot of land, the shoreline stretching out endlessly, the sound of the ocean pulling at something deep within me, and how I promised myself that one day I would build a refuge there, not just for me, but for the family I loved. Every nail I hammered, every board I carried, every dollar I saved to complete it came with a cost to my body and my spirit. Yet the vision of what it would mean to us fueled me, because I wanted my daughter to grow up, knowing that even in a world that often takes more than it gives, there could still be a place built from love and sacrifice that belonged only to us. The walls of that house had heard her childish giggles as she ran from room to room. They had seen her mother and me sit on the porch at sunset, our hands entwined as we watched her play in the sand. They had carried the silence of grief after her mother passed, when I sat alone listening to the waves for comfort. The house became not just a building but a chronicle, each room telling a chapter of our story, each photograph on the wall a reminder that no sacrifice had been too great when it came to keeping our family whole. To have her now treated as nothing more than a convenient getaway for her honeymoon cut deeply, because it revealed that she saw none of that history, none of that meaning, only a possession to be used without thought or gratitude. As I sat in the living room looking at the framed photographs, her small hands once covered in sand as she held seashells proudly toward me, her mother's smile lighting up summer afternoons, I realized that if I gave the house away to her in this manner, I would be betraying not only myself, but also the woman who had stood by me when it was first built, and the child who once promised she would treasure it forever. The symbolism of the beach house reached far beyond its walls. It represented every moment I had put my family before myself, every dream I had buried so that hers could live, every hour of labor that had left me weary but determined. And I knew then that it had to be protected not for her honeymoon, not for her husband, but for the legacy it carried. It was not just property, it was proof. Proof that love had once guided our lives. Proof that sacrifice had built something tangible. Proof that I was more than a man to be mocked or dismissed. In its windows I saw my past. In its walls I felt my endurance. In its foundation I recognized my worth. And in that recognition I found clarity. If I allowed her to use it so carelessly after excluding me from her wedding, it would no longer stand as a symbol of love and sacrifice. It would stand as a monument to entitlement and disrespect, and that I could not accept. The house was mine, not just by deed but by history, and if she wanted to erase me from her new life, then she would also have to accept that this part of my life would never belong to her. Not until she understood its meaning, not until she respected what it stood for. In the symbolism of the beach house, I saw both my past and my future, and I knew it would become the line that divided what I would endure from what I would no longer allow. After nights of restless thought and the heavy silence that came from staring at the beach house walls, while memories pressed in on me, I knew I could no longer trust sentiment alone to guide my decisions. I needed to ground my resolve in something stronger, something unshakable, and so I sought counsel from a man who had always been steady in my life, a lawyer I had known for years, who had helped me manage small matters with quiet professionalism. And I walked into his office, carrying not only folders of documents, but the weight of betrayal that had finally hardened into determination. I remember sitting across from his polished desk, the sound of the clock on the wall ticking in steady rhythm, and as he looked at me with patient eyes, I explained everything, from the letter of exclusion, to the overheard words at the restaurant, to the request for my beach house. And as I spoke, the anger I had buried came through in my voice, not in shouts, but in the quiet firmness of a man who had finally decided he would no longer be dismissed. He listened carefully, never interrupting, his hands folded neatly on the desk, and when I finished he leaned back and told me that my instincts were correct, that I needed to protect the house, not because of spite, but because it represented both my financial stability and my legacy, and that once it was placed beyond reach, no one could take it from me, no matter how entitled they felt. He explained the legal tools at my disposal, trusts and transfers, structures that could secure the property while still allowing me to live there and enjoy it as I always had. And as his words sank in, I felt a calm I had not known in weeks, because finally I had a plan that did not rely on pleading for respect, but on ensuring my sacrifices could not be trampled by ingratitude. I handed him the documents I had brought, the deed, the old receipts, the photographs that showed the history of the house, and I told him that this place was more than real estate. It was the soul of my family. And he nodded, telling me that he understood, that he had seen too many families torn apart when children forgot what had been given to them, and that I was wise to act now rather than wait until it was too late. His professionalism steadied me, and though the law can be cold and unfeeling, in his words I found validation, a reminder that I was not wrong to protect what I had built, that boundaries were not cruelty but necessity. We went over every detail, how to ensure the transfer would be airtight, how to prevent challenges, how to leave instructions that honored the memory of my late wife, while keeping the house safe from those who saw me only as a resource. I signed papers with a hand that no longer trembled, each stroke of the pen feeling like a reclaiming of myself, and as the ink dried, I realized I was no longer the man sitting helplessly by the bathroom wall of my own life. I was the man standing firm, saying no more. When I left his office, the air outside felt different, lighter, as though the burden I had carried for so long had begun to lift. And though I knew there would be confrontations ahead, I also knew I had the law on my side, and that knowledge was a shield against the storm that was sure to come. Seeking counsel was not just about legal protection, it was about reclaiming my voice, finding the strength to say that I mattered, that my sacrifices had meaning, that my legacy would not be handed over to those who could not honor it. And as I drove back to the beach house with the sound of the ocean waiting for me, I felt a steadiness in my chest, the quiet power of a man who had finally turned grief into strategy. It was only a few days after I had placed the beach house safely into the trust that her next message arrived, and if I thought her earlier request was bold, this one carried a sharpness that revealed just how far her sense of entitlement had grown, because it was not written as a plea or even a confident assumption. It was delivered as an ultimatum, a blunt declaration that if I did not hand over the house for her honeymoon, then she would consider it the final act of betrayal on my part, and she would cut ties with me for good. I remember sitting at the kitchen table when her words flashed across my phone, the steam rising from my untouched cup of coffee, and for a long while I simply stared at the screen, my hands heavy at my sides, because in those words I heard not the voice of the daughter I had raised, but the voice of someone who believed she could corner me with threats, someone who believed that my love for her was a weakness she could exploit until the very end. The ultimatum was clear and unapologetic. She wrote that I had done enough damage by not being part of her wedding, that if I wanted any chance of a relationship in the future, I would prove it now by giving her what she wanted. And she finished by saying she did not have time for drawn-out discussions, that either I gave her the keys or I lost her forever. As I read those words, I felt something inside me settle, not with sorrow, but with a calmness that surprised me, because I realized in that moment that she had already made her choice long before sending that message, and this ultimatum was nothing more than the final mask falling away, exposing the depth of her ingratitude and the cruelty of her detachment. I thought of all the times I had given without hesitation, the tuition paid, the car bought, the rent covered, the countless little needs met with sacrifice on my part, and I wondered how those years could be repaid with such coldness. How she could take the story of a father who had poured everything into her and twist it into leverage for a house she had not earned. For a fleeting moment I felt the old ache of longing, the desire to protect her, to give in just to keep her near, but the longer I stared at her words, the clearer it became that giving in would not bring her closer. It would only push me further into the role she had assigned me, a role where I was nothing but a servant to her wants, and I could no longer bear to live like that. The ultimatum forced me to confront a truth I had resisted for too long, that love cannot survive when it is drained of respect, that sacrifice loses its meaning when it is met with threats instead of gratitude, and as painful as it was to accept, I knew that this message was not a choice between losing her and keeping her. It was a choice between losing myself and reclaiming my dignity. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, listening to the quiet of the house, the kind of quiet that had once felt heavy but now carried a strange peace, and I realized that her ultimatum had given me freedom. Freedom to stop hoping for change that would never come. Freedom to stop believing that my love alone could mend the rift. Freedom to stand firm in the knowledge that I had already given more than enough. I did not reply immediately. I let the hours pass, choosing my words carefully, not because I wanted to win her approval, but because I wanted my response to reflect the strength I had finally embraced. The ultimatum had been delivered with arrogance, but my answer would come with composure, for dignity does not need to shout, it only needs to remain unbroken. When I finally chose to respond to her ultimatum, I did so, not with the fire of anger, nor with the pleading of a desperate father, but with the calm that only comes when a man has accepted the truth and found his strength in it, because I knew that nothing I could say would pierce the armor of entitlement she had built around herself, and so my words had to reflect, not the hope of reconciliation, but the dignity of a man who would not bend any further. I sat at my desk with the phone in my hand, staring at the blank message box for a long time, and I thought of the countless nights I had stayed awake worrying about her, the times I had picked her up from late events, the money I had scraped together to give her every opportunity, and I realized that for years my responses to her demands had always been immediate, quick affirmations that I would handle it, that I would cover it, that I would give what she needed. But this time I let the silence stretch until I was sure she felt the weight of it. When I finally began to type, I chose each word with care, telling her that I understood her request, that I would make arrangements regarding the beach house, and that she need not worry about logistics, for everything would be handled in time for her honeymoon. I kept the tone measured, almost formal, and not a single word revealed the plan that had already been set in motion with the lawyer. Not a single word hinted at the fact that the house no longer stood vulnerable to her demands. I knew that if I met her ultimatum with defiance, she would lash out with fury. If I met it with pleading, she would see it as weakness. But by answering with composure, I gave her nothing to twist against me, nothing to use as proof that I was bitter or unreasonable. And in that calm, I found my greatest strength. I ended the message with a simple assurance that everything would be taken care of, and as I pressed send I felt a strange peace settle over me, because I had not lowered myself to her level. I had not tried to justify my worth to someone who had already dismissed it. I had simply responded as a man who knew the truth and held it close. The phone buzzed soon after with her reply, a short acknowledgement followed by a heart emoji that once might have warmed me but now felt hollow, because I could see the emptiness behind it, the casual dismissal of a daughter who believed she had secured her victory. I set the phone down and looked out the window toward the horizon where the sky met the sea, and I let myself breathe slowly, reminding myself that she had no idea what was coming, that the calmness she mistook for surrender was in fact the mask of preparation. I thought of her fiancé too, the man who had laughed at me in the restaurant, the man who believed I was too weak to stand against them, and I could almost imagine his smug satisfaction when she showed him my response, how he would surely toast their success and speak of how easy it had been to bend me once more. What they did not understand was that my calm response was not a capitulation but a strategy, the steady silence before a storm that would not rage wildly but strike with precision. I felt no guilt in hiding my plan, because a man who has been dismissed and mocked has no obligation to reveal his defense before it is time. And I told myself that when the day came, when they arrived at the house expecting comfort and control, they would see the truth laid out clearly before them. And in that moment, the calm words I had written would echo differently in their minds, not as surrender, but as the first step in reclaiming my dignity. After sending my calm response, I knew the time had come to finalize what I had set in motion, and so I threw myself into the quiet work of preparing everything with the precision of a man who had carried burdens his whole life and had finally decided that this one would be the last he allowed anyone to add to. I returned to my lawyer's office with a determination that left no room for hesitation, and together we went through every detail of the trust that would place the beach house beyond the reach of my daughter and her husband, securing it in a way that no threats or ultimatums could undo. The paperwork was thorough, every clause written to ensure permanence, every line crafted to guard not only the property but the legacy it represented. And as I signed each page, I felt the weight of years lifting, as if every stroke of the pen was reclaiming a piece of myself I had given away too freely. My lawyer assured me that once filed, the trust would stand firm, and he reminded me that what I was doing was not cruel but necessary. A father's final act of protection, not for a child who had forgotten him, but for the memory of the family that had once valued his sacrifices. I walked out of his office with the document sealed and the certainty that no matter what came next, the house was safe, and that safety gave me a strength I had not felt in years. But I did not stop there, because part of me wanted them to see, wanted them to confront the truth in a way that left no room for doubt, and so I began my secret preparations for the moment of revelation. I visited the house, changed the locks quietly, ensured that every corner was secure, and I placed a letter on the table inside, a letter written in my own hand, one that explained with calm dignity why the house was no longer theirs to claim, why their betrayal had drawn a line that could never be crossed again. Writing that letter was not easy, for each word carried the weight of memories. And as I wrote of the sacrifices that had built those walls, I felt both the ache of loss and the steadiness of resolve. But I knew the letter would speak louder than any confrontation could, because it would be there waiting when they arrived expecting victory, only to find truth staring them in the face. I stocked the house not with groceries as she had demanded, but with the evidence of the trust, documents framed and displayed on the kitchen counter, papers that bore my signature and the seal of the law, a silent declaration that the legacy of the beach house was no longer vulnerable to their entitlement. As I moved through the rooms making these preparations, I thought of the summers when laughter filled them, of the warmth of my wife's hand in mine as we watched our daughter play. And though sorrow tugged at me, I knew I was honoring those memories by protecting what they represented. Each lock I turned, each drawer I checked, each paper I placed was part of a ritual of closure, a ritual of reclaiming. And when I finally stood in the center of the living room with the ocean wind drifting through the open windows, I felt a calm pride that steadied me for what was to come. They believed they had won, that my calm response was surrender, that my silence was weakness. But in truth, every moment of quiet had been preparation, every word unspoken had been strategy, and the secret preparations I completed in those days were not acts of spite, but of justice. When I closed the door behind me for the last time before their arrival, I did so with the certainty that the house was ready, that I was ready, and that the truth would soon unfold in a way they could never have predicted, a way that would finally show them the strength of the man they had so gravely underestimated. The morning of their arrival at the beach house came with a sky painted in soft grays, the ocean restless, as if it already sensed the storm that was about to unfold. And though I was not there to witness it in person, I could imagine every detail because I knew my daughter well enough to see her impatience and her new husband well enough to picture the smug satisfaction on his face as they approached the house, believing it was theirs to claim. They drove up the narrow road in a rented car, her dress casual but carefully chosen to flaunt her happiness, his sunglasses hiding the arrogance in his eyes. And I could almost hear the tone of their laughter as they carried their luggage toward the front steps, expecting to walk into comfort provided by the very man they had dismissed. In their minds I had already surrendered, my calm response interpreted as compliance, my silence mistaken for weakness, and they arrived certain that the beach house stood ready for them, stocked and waiting like a hotel suite. I imagined the moment when they reached the door, keys in hand perhaps, though the locks had already been changed, and the first flicker of confusion passing across their faces when the old keys failed to turn. I could see them trying again and again, her voice rising with irritation, his words sharp as he insisted there must have been a mistake, and then the dawning realization that something was different, that this was not the easy victory they had expected. They would call me, of course, demand an explanation, their voices carrying the same tone of entitlement I had come to know so well. But by the time they reached the threshold, the truth would already be waiting for them inside. For once I let myself smile at the thought of them walking through that door after forcing it open, expecting to see flowers and provisions, only to be met with the letter I had left on the table. Its words calm but unflinching, its message undeniable. I pictured her standing still as her eyes scanned the lines, the color draining from her cheeks as she read the story of my sacrifices laid out plainly, the reminder of every moment I had given without hesitation, the explanation of why the house meant more than walls and windows, and the declaration that it had been secured in a trust that placed it beyond their reach forever. I imagined the groom's reaction too, his arrogance faltering, his voice cracking with frustration as he realized there was nothing he could threaten, nothing he could demand, because the law was stronger than his pride. And for the first time he would have to face the fact that the man he had mocked was not the fool he believed him to be. The arrival at the beach house was supposed to be their triumph, a honeymoon in a place they had taken without gratitude, but instead it became the stage for their first confrontation with truth, a truth they could not twist, a truth they could not laugh away, a truth that would mark the beginning of their unraveling. I thought of her standing there, with the waves crashing outside the window, holding the letter in her trembling hands, and I wondered if she felt shame, if she remembered the summers of her childhood, if she finally understood that love is not measured in possessions, but in respect, and that once respect is lost, no house in the world can restore it. The image of their arrival filled me not with bitterness, but with a sense of justice, because I had not shouted, I had not begged, I had not fought with fury. I had prepared with calm and allowed the truth to speak for itself. And in that truth I knew they would see me differently, not as the weak old man they thought they could control, but as a father who had drawn a line that could never again be crossed. The revelation came the moment they stepped into the beach house. For while they had expected to be greeted by comfort and luxury, by stocked cabinets and neatly folded linens, by the quiet assurance that their entitlement had once again been rewarded, what they found instead was silence, broken only by the sound of waves crashing outside and the sight of a single envelope placed carefully on the kitchen table with their names written across it in my steady hand. I was not there in person, but I can see it clearly in my mind, the way their confidence faltered as they looked around the room and realized it was empty of everything they had demanded, no food waiting, no lights glowing warmly. Only the echo of their own footsteps bouncing off the walls. My daughter must have picked up the letter with trembling hands, unfolding the paper that carried my words, and as her eyes traced each line she would have felt the weight of history pressing against her, for I had written not in anger, but in truth, reminding her of the sacrifices that had built that house, of the years of labor that had given her the life she lived, of the nights I spent carrying both her and her mother in my heart. I told her in those pages that the house was no longer hers to request, that it had been secured in a trust that placed it beyond the reach of greed, beyond the reach of entitlement, beyond the reach of anyone who saw me as nothing more than a provider of comfort. I explained that I had acted not out of bitterness, but out of love for what the house represented, the memory of her mother, the laughter of her childhood, the dignity of my own labor, and that to allow it to be reduced to a mere convenience would have been to dishonor everything we once held sacred. I told her that respect cannot be demanded with threats, that love cannot be built on ultimatums, and that the bond between father and daughter must be nurtured with gratitude, not entitlement. As she read those words, I imagined the groom standing beside her, his face tightening with frustration, his voice rising as he demanded to know what it meant. And I imagined her silence in that moment, the silence of a woman who could no longer deny the truth laid bare before her. The revelation was not only in the letter, but in the documents I had placed alongside it. Framed pages that bore the seal of the law, proof that the beach house was locked away in perpetuity, that no argument, no lawsuit, no demand could pry it from the trust that held it secure. For once, their laughter would be gone, replaced by the heavy realization that they had underestimated me completely, that the man they had mocked as weak had outmaneuvered them with patience and foresight. The house itself stood as a witness to their shock, the walls that once held her laughter now reflecting the silence of her shame, and in that silence I believe she finally saw me clearly, not as a resource, but as a man who had chosen dignity over appeasement. The revelation was not cruel, it was necessary, for without it, she might have continued believing that she could take without consequence, that love would always outweigh respect, that her father would always bend. As the waves crashed outside and the wind rattled the windows, I imagine her standing still, letter in hand, heart pounding with the recognition that she had pushed too far, and though the groom may have raged, though he may have cursed my name, though he may have spoken of retaliation, none of it mattered in the face of documents that told them both there was no path forward but acceptance. The revelation was complete, and with it came the shift in power, for I had not only protected my home, but reclaimed my dignity, and the truth they now carried with them would follow them long after they left those walls. When the truth of my letter and the documents I had left sank in, I imagined the first sound to cut through the silence was not my daughter's voice, but the sharp, furious tone of her new husband, because arrogance cannot tolerate humiliation, and entitlement cannot bear to be denied. And from what I later heard from those who were nearby, his rage echoed through the walls of the beach house like a storm breaking loose. He shouted that I had tricked them, that I had no right to take away what he considered theirs, his voice rising with the kind of fury that comes when pride is wounded more deeply than desire. And he slammed his fist against the counter, where the letter still rested as if force could undo words written in truth and law. He cursed me by name, called me selfish, called me manipulative, claimed that I had planned the entire thing just to embarrass them, and in his blind fury he revealed more about himself than he intended, because every insult he hurled at me was in fact a reflection of the greed that had guided his every step. My daughter tried to calm him, I am certain of it, her voice faltering as she told him to lower his tone, but even her presence could not silence the outrage that boiled within him, for he had built his image of strength on the belief that I was weak, and now that image had crumbled before the weight of a truth he could not refute. He threatened legal action, waving his arms as though his anger could summon power, but when his eyes fell again on the framed documents, sealed and signed, he knew in his heart there was nothing to be done, and that realization only fueled his rage further. He paced the room like a trapped animal, shouting that they deserved better, that they had been wronged, that I had betrayed them, while my daughter stood by silently, her face pale, her hands clutching the letter as though it might burn her if she held it too tightly. In his rage he knocked over a chair, slammed a door, shouted words that could be heard beyond the porch. And the irony of it all was that with every outburst he proved the very point I had made in my letter, that the house could never be entrusted to someone who valued it only as a prize to be won rather than a legacy to be honored. The neighbors heard him too, and though they did not intervene, they carried the story forward, whispering of the scene that unfolded inside the house, a story that spread quickly and left its mark on how people saw him afterward. Not as a man of strength, but as a man who could not handle truth without descending into fury. His rage filled the house that once held laughter, his voice crashing against the walls as if he could drown out the ocean itself. But rage has no power against the permanence of law, against the calm weight of a father's resolve. And eventually the fire of his anger must have burned into the ashes of defeat. I was not there to hear his last words, but I know how men like him sound when their power slips away, voices hoarse, movements frantic, pride shattered into pieces too sharp to pick up. And I know that when they finally left the house, his rage followed him like a shadow that would cling to him long after the waves had washed the porch clean of his footprints. His rage was loud, but my silence was louder, and though he may never admit it, in that moment he learned that arrogance cannot triumph over resolve, and entitlement cannot claim what was never theirs to begin with. After the storm of her husband's rage had thundered through the beach house, there came a silence heavier than any noise, and in that silence I know my daughter stood still with the letter still in her hands, her eyes tracing the words again and again, unable to deny their truth, and though the man beside her raged and cursed and threw his tantrum against walls that had once echoed with her childhood laughter, she remained quiet, her silence more powerful than his fury because it spoke of something deeper than anger. It spoke of recognition. I can see her face in my mind, pale and stricken, her lips parted as if to speak, but no words forming. Because what words could she summon when confronted with the undeniable record of my sacrifices and the finality of my resolve? What excuses could she make when the very walls around her reminded her of summers we once shared, of evenings when her mother's smile filled the air, of the father who had given everything so that she could stand where she was? Silence became her only refuge. But it was not the silence of strength, it was the silence of shame. The silence of a daughter who had finally realized that she had pushed too far, that the father she had dismissed as weak had acted with a dignity she had not expected. While her husband shouted threats and paced the room, she stood frozen, her hands trembling as she folded my letter, her eyes avoiding his as though she could not bear to meet them, because in that moment she must have known that his influence had guided her into this humiliation, and that knowledge cut more deeply than any of his words. The silence stretched long after his voice grew hoarse, filling the space with its weight, and I know that silence followed her out of the house when they finally left, the waves crashing behind them as if to punctuate the truth she could no longer ignore. I imagine the drive away was marked by his muttering, his fists clenching the wheel, his anger spilling over into accusations. But she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her mind replaying not his fury, but my calm words. The simple yet undeniable explanation that I had protected the house because it was more than wood and stone, it was the story of our family, a story she had tried to erase. Silence became her answer. When friends later asked about the honeymoon, silence when relatives whispered about the spectacle at the house, silence when her husband continued to curse my name, and that silence told me more than any apology ever could, because it revealed that for the first time she had nothing left to argue, no justification, no defense. Her silence was the acknowledgement of guilt she could not speak aloud, the admission that in her heart she knew she had wronged me. And though she did not reach out, though she did not call, I felt that silence across the miles like a fragile thread, one that told me she was finally beginning to understand. The silence of my daughter became the echo of my vindication, for I had spent years listening to her demands, her dismissals, her cold words shaped by the man beside her, and now at last there was no dismissal, no demand, only the quiet that comes when truth finally settles into a soul. I do not know if her silence will one day turn into words of remorse, if she will ever gather the courage to step back into my life with sincerity. But what I do know is that in that moment her silence was louder than her husband's rage, louder than the whispers of the guests who had once mocked me, louder than the years of distance that had grown between us, and in that silence I found the first trace of peace, for it meant that she had finally seen me, not as a wallet, not as a resource, but as a father who had drawn a line that could not be crossed. When the dust settled and I found myself alone again in the quiet of my own home, I finally allowed space for reflection, and in that reflection I traced the long road that had brought me from sacrifice to exclusion, from heartbreak to resolve, and finally to the vindication of reclaiming what was rightfully mine. And I realized that while the pain of my daughter's choices had cut deeply, they had also forced me to see myself with a clarity I had not known in years. I sat in my chair near the window, the evening light spilling across the room, and I thought of the boy I once was, the man I became, the father who promised that his daughter would never go without, and how every step of that promise had defined my life, shaping me into someone who gave endlessly without expecting anything in return, believing that love would naturally flow back. For years, that belief had sustained me, but as I reflected, I saw how it had also blinded me, how I had mistaken my silence for strength, how I had allowed entitlement to grow unchecked because I thought patience was love, And I realize now that true love requires boundaries, that sacrifice without respect is not devotion, but surrender. I looked around my living room, at the photographs of her childhood still hanging on the walls, and though sorrow still lingered, there was no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance that she was no longer the little girl who once clung to my hand, and that the woman she had become had to live with her choices just as I had to live with mine. The beach house came to my mind again, its windows facing the sea, its rooms filled with echoes of laughter and loss. And I felt pride that I had protected it, pride that I had honored the memory of her mother and the labor of my own hands, pride that I had not allowed it to be reduced to a stepping stone in someone else's entitled story. Reflection showed me that in protecting the house, I had also protected myself, because the act of saying no was not about denying her a honeymoon. It was about affirming my dignity, about drawing a line that told the world I was not invisible, I was not disposable, I was still a man of worth. I thought too of her silence after the revelation, and in that silence I sensed the first cracks in her armor of entitlement. The possibility that one day she might remember who I truly was, not the caricature her husband painted, but the father who had built her world brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. Yet even if that day never comes, I told myself I have already found peace, because my reflection showed me that I do not need her acknowledgement to validate my life. I do not need her gratitude to confirm my worth. I only need the certainty that I acted with integrity when it mattered most. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the night, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, and I felt the rhythm of time moving forward, steady and unstoppable, reminding me that life does not pause for sorrow. It carries us onward, and it is up to us to carry dignity with us as we go. Reflection turned my pain into wisdom, my grief into resolve, and as I sat there, I felt a calm pride that no letter of exclusion, no ultimatum, no outburst of rage could ever take away. I had walked through fire and emerged stronger, not because the world had honored me, but because I had finally honored myself. Vindication did not arrive with applause or celebration. It came quietly, like the steady tide against the shore, and as I sat alone in my home with the weight of my decisions behind me, I felt a peace that I had not known in years. A peace born from finally standing firm when every part of me had once been bent by sacrifice and love given without measure. I thought of the long journey that had brought me here, the years of toil, the nights of grief, the countless moments of giving, and how those moments had been overlooked by the very person who should have cherished them most. And yet in the end it was not her acknowledgement that gave me closure, it was my own resolve. Vindication came the moment I secured the beach house beyond her reach, the moment I knew that my sacrifices would not be trampled by arrogance, that my legacy would not be reduced to a prize for those who mocked me. It came in the silence that followed her husband's rage, in the shame that clouded her eyes, in the whispers of neighbors who spoke of what had unfolded, not as my defeat, but as my quiet triumph. For once the story of my life was no longer about endless giving. It was about reclaiming. It was about reminding myself and those around me that dignity is not something others bestow. It is something a man holds within himself and protects fiercely when tested. As I walked through the rooms of the beach house one final time that week, listening to the ocean crash against the shore, I felt the presence of my late wife with me, her laughter still lingering in the walls, her spirit woven into the very fabric of that place, and I knew she would have been proud that I had protected what we built together. Vindication was not just for me. It was for her. It was for the memory of the family we once were. And it was for the promise I had kept to myself, that I would never let our love be disrespected by those who could not see its worth. My daughter had made her choice, and while it pained me to know she had chosen distance over gratitude, I also understood that her journey was hers to live, and perhaps one day she would look back and see the truth more clearly. But even if that day never came, I no longer carried the burden of waiting for it, because vindication had freed me from needing her acknowledgement. I walked along the beach at sunset, the sky streaked with colors that seemed to mirror the calm in my heart, and I let the waves wash over my feet, each one reminding me that time moves forward, cleansing, renewing, unyielding. Vindication was knowing that I had drawn a line, that I had not allowed my love to be twisted into servitude, that I had acted with the quiet strength of a man who finally chose himself after years of being overlooked. People around town began to look at me differently too, some with respect, others with quiet admiration, and a few even confessed that they wished they had the courage to do what I had done. And in their words I heard the truth that this was not only my story, it was the story of every parent who has ever been taken for granted, every soul who has ever given without recognition. Vindication was the lesson that boundaries are not walls of cruelty but pillars of dignity. And as I closed the door of the beach house behind me, its locks secure and its future protected, I knew that my legacy was intact. I no longer feared being forgotten because I had preserved the proof of my sacrifices, and I no longer feared being dismissed because I had shown that I could not be erased. Vindication was mine, quiet but absolute. And as I stood under the evening sky, I realized that for the first time in many years I was not a man defined by what I had given away. I was a man defined by what I had reclaimed. And in that truth I found not only peace but triumph. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.